On February 18, 2001, millions of people sat down to watch what was supposed to be a historic moment in American motorsports, the opening of the season at the Daytona 500. The air hummed with anticipation. The sun had already warmed the tarmac, and the smell of hot rubber, gasoline, and concession stand fries braided together into the scent of racing day. For fans who had camped overnight, for executives in suits, for broadcasters rearranging camera angles, and for the drivers themselves, this felt like more than a race. It was a cultural event. The sport had been growing in leaps. NASCAR had parlayed regional passion into national attention and a new television era, with deals that put the sport squarely in front of mainstream America through the likes of Fox Sports, NBC, and Turner Broadcasting System, meant the grandstands were overflowing with nearly 200,000 fans, and living rooms across the country were packed, too. And at the center of it all was one man, Dale Earnhardt. He wasn't just a driver. He was the measure of toughness for a generation. He carried the kind of reputation that made young racers imitate his lines and old rivals respect him in a way they rarely voiced. For some he was the roar of the engines made human. For others he was the stubborn heart of a sport that prized grit above all. Have you ever watched someone and felt that their presence alone commands a room, or, in this case, a track? That day, Earnhardt was both legend and weathered veteran. His record read like a chronicle of survival, bones set back into place, bones broken and mended, a career stitched together through pain and determination. Yet, he'd never quite conquered this particular race. The Daytona 500 had been cruel more often than kind, a race that, for all its glamour, had a way of turning hope into heartbreak. When he finally won in 1998, it had been a catharsis. The pit lane had emptied into a human corridor to congratulate him. But by 2001, the physical reminders of decades behind the wheel had accumulated, a shoulder that whispered of old fractures, a neck that remembered violent jolts. Friends and crew members said he had thought about retiring. Instead, he chose to keep driving. Why would a man who had already reached so much keep returning to that dangerous theater? Maybe because the track was where he felt most himself, or because he believed veterans still had something to teach the young. Or perhaps because some men are wired to chase the next checkered flag, no matter the cost. The race itself became a study in chaos and choreography. 14 drivers traded the lead dozens of times. Steel and speed braided into a blur as cars ran inches apart at nearly 200 miles per hour. Side-by-side duels unfolded like dances, daring, precise, and terrifying. At one stretch, Earnhardt even gestured at a young rival, flashing a playful middle finger at Kurt Busch while they brushed paint and pride. But motorsport is a drama where a single spark can ignite catastrophe. With 27 laps remaining, fate offered its harshest lesson. A chain reaction crash unfolded down the backstretch in a spray of metal and glass, an aerial ballet gone wrong. 18 cars were involved. Among the dancers was Tony Stewart. His car flipped in a heart-stopping moment before landing upside down. For spectators, the sight looked catastrophic. Yet, in the odd mercy of the sport, he walked away. While crews tended to the wreckage and officials conferred, Earnhardt's voice came over the radio, gruff, direct, and unambiguous. They're going to have to do something about these cars, or they're going to get someone killed. At the time, it might have sounded like a veteran's complaint about equipment or aerodynamics. But when the day is later read in the quiet of hindsight, those words feel like a premonition. How does a man say something so stark and then continue on, as if nothing extraordinary had passed? What does it mean to make a choice, and to believe in the consequences of that choice, in the same breath? As the race wound on, another subplot unfolded, loyalty. Earnhardt was not racing for himself alone. He was racing for his teammates and for a friend who had waited a long time. Michael Waltrip had been in the sport for 16 years without a victory. Earnhardt, who valued teamwork and mentorship, had helped him find rides and sponsors. Before the race, he had told those who drove for him, "This race will take teamwork." That sentiment wasn't a slogan. It was a strategy. When the moment arrived, Earnhardt executed it with relentless precision. He slid into a role that most drivers would find instinctively selfish. He became the protector, the roadblock, the guardian behind the leader. He allowed Michael Waltrip to take the lead, then settled behind him to fend off challengers for 17 laps. From the broadcast booth, Darrell Waltrip's voice trembled with a mixture of disbelief and awe at the display. For fans watching, it was theater, an elder statesman shielding his protege, a general holding a line at all costs. But it also placed Earnhardt in a vulnerable position, in the middle of the pack, where the threat is greatest and the margin for error vanishes. Is there nobility in putting yourself in harm's way for someone else? In sport, as in life, the answer can be heartbreakingly expensive. When the final lap began, the race's tempo quickened and the tape of small incidents assembled into a decisive chain. A light tap, barely visible on television, set a sequence in motion. The black number 3 car drifted, contacted the outside wall at an angle that looked deceptively mild, and came to a sudden stop. On screens across the country, viewers saw a car that had struck concrete and stalled. There was no fiery explosion, no rolling barrel. It looked, to many, like an ordinary crash, the kind that drivers walk away from. But what looks ordinary from afar can be devastating up close. Inside the cockpit, the physics told a different story. The impact compressed the space in less than a tenth of a second. Forces that feel intangible to spectators became brutally concrete when they meet human flesh and bone. The violent forward snap of Earnhardt's head produced a basilar skull fracture, a lethal injury that had already claimed drivers within recent memory. The cameras pivoted away, following the checkered flag drama at the finish line where Michael Waltrip crossed to win his first Daytona 500. Imagine the disorienting contrast of jubilation and dread. Michael Waltrip should have been elated, embraced by teammates and fans who had waited a lifetime for this. Instead, there was an unignorable quiet growing in his voice as he sought the person who had been his guardian on the track. He kept asking over and over, "Where's Dale?" At the crash site, another driver had stopped beside him. Ken Schrader climbed from his car, dazed and bruised, and walked over. He peered into the cockpit. What did he see? What did he think in those first seconds when the magnitude of the injury became painfully obvious? The human impulse to look, to check on a colleague, a friend, a legend, is immediate. It's a tiny act against a towering calamity. The aftermath ripped through the sport. For fans who had cheered that afternoon, there was the slow, difficult unspooling of what had happened. For teammates and family, there were questions that never quite find clean answers. Could anything have prevented it? Had the sport been complacent about its dangers? When do tradition and spectacle become too high a price for human life? What responsibility does a sport bear to its participants? And when tragedy exposes systemic risk, how should those in power respond? In the years that followed, those questions would not sit quietly. Equipment, track safety, and medical protocols were scrutinized and rethought. Changes that had once seemed optional moved toward necessity. But immediate grief and the nerve-struck quiet among teams that night were visceral and raw. The cars kept running, the cameras kept rolling, but something essential had shifted. People remember the image of the black car and the stunned faces in the pits. They remember Michael Waltrip's lonely, stunned crossing. They remember the words Earnhardt spoke over the radio minutes earlier, which now read as an eerie foreshadowing. And they remember how the community, drivers, crews, officials, and fans, had to reconcile their love for the sport with the reality that love sometimes requires change. Can a moment of loss carry the seed of renewal? Many would say yes. Tragedy forces attention. It forces uncomfortable conversations and, sometimes, progress. But progress comes slowly, and it arrives on a path paved with the memory of what was lost. When people look back at that 2001 race now, there's an almost mythic quality to the story. The elder statesman who risked everything for another's first victory, the terrifying suddenness of fate, the collective shock that rippled across the nation. How do we hold those images in our minds? With sorrow, with reverence, with the urgent insistence that improvements be made. Perhaps the most haunting question is the one that lingers after the engines fall silent. When someone warns of danger in plain language, how often do we only understand the gravity of that warning after it becomes true? The Daytona 500 that year remains a hinge in racing history. A day when a sport's growth collided with its fragility, and when the actions of one man, both heroic and human, altered how the racing world saw itself. Would you have done the same as he did? Would you have put your body between history and a friend? That question, like the sound of a distant engine, keeps echoing long after the checkered flag has fallen. He pulled down the window net. Then he looked inside. What he saw changed him forever. In the 20-plus years since that day, Ken Schrader has never publicly described that moment. Not in interviews. Not in books. Not even to close friends. The silence itself tells a story. Some moments are simply too heavy to put into words. But witnesses noticed something immediately. Instead of giving the typical thumbs up signal drivers use after crashes, Schrader began waving frantically for help. Not a calm gesture. Not the usual signal that a driver was conscious and okay. It was urgent. Panicked. The kind of motion that instantly told everyone nearby that something was terribly wrong. Medical crews rushed to the scene. The roar of engines faded into an uneasy quiet as emergency workers surrounded the wrecked car. Within minutes, Dale Earnhardt was being carefully removed and transported to the hospital. Meanwhile, just a few hundred yards away, something surreal was happening. Michael Waltrip stood in victory lane holding the trophy. Confetti floated through the air. Cameras flashed. Crew members celebrated the biggest win of his life. But Waltrip kept asking the same question. Where's Dale? At first, the question seemed ordinary. After all, Earnhardt was his team owner and mentor. The man who believed in him when others didn't. But as the minutes passed and no answer came, the mood slowly began to shift. Something felt wrong. Imagine that moment. Winning the most important race of your life, while slowly realizing something terrible may have happened to the man who made it possible. How would you even process that? Joy and fear colliding in the same heartbeat. Celebration mixed with dread. It's a moment that no one there would ever forget. And yet, the tragedy unfolding that afternoon would soon force the entire sport to confront difficult truths. The device that might have saved him. Here is the part of the story that many people still struggle to accept. The technology that could likely have saved Earnhardt already existed. It was called the Hans device, short for head and neck support. It wasn't large. It wasn't complicated. In fact, it weighed just over a pound. Yet that small piece of equipment was designed to prevent exactly the type of head movement that causes fatal skull fractures during sudden crashes. The principle behind it was simple. During a violent impact, a driver's body stops suddenly because of the seatbelt. But the head keeps moving forward. That rapid motion can place enormous stress on the base of the skull. The Hans device anchors the helmet to the body, preventing that deadly snap. Today, it seems obvious. But in 2001, the device was controversial. Many drivers disliked it. They believed it was uncomfortable, restrictive. Some feared it might trap them inside a burning car if they needed to escape quickly. Others felt it limited their ability to turn their heads while racing at 200 miles per hour. And racing culture at the time valued toughness above almost everything else. Drivers prided themselves on pushing limits. Risk was simply part of the job. Earnhardt himself was known for that mentality. When reporters once asked if he would wear the Hans device, his answer was blunt. I ain't wearing that damn noose. The statement reflected the thinking of many drivers back then. Safety equipment was often seen as optional, or even unnecessary. On race day, only a handful of drivers chose to wear the device. One of them was Kyle Petty. His decision came after unimaginable personal loss. Just months earlier, Kyle's son Adam Petty had died in a crash during a practice session. After losing his son, Kyle made a promise to himself. He would try anything that might keep him safe, even if others doubted it. Looking back today, that decision seems incredibly wise. But at the time, it was far from common. And it raises an important question. How often do people resist change until tragedy forces them to reconsider? Strange moments before the race. In the days leading up to the Daytona 500, several people noticed something unusual about Earnhardt. He seemed different, happier than usual, more relaxed, more reflective. During an interview with Darrell Waltrip, something unexpected happened. Earnhardt suddenly jumped out of his chair and said he finally had everything in life figured out. His family, his career, his team. He spoke about feeling content, satisfied, almost peaceful. Friends who witnessed the moment later described it as emotional. Not dramatic, but meaningful. Almost like a man celebrating life itself. At the time, nobody thought much about it. Why would they? Athletes often reflect on their careers. But after the crash, those memories took on a different tone. People began replaying those moments in their minds. searching for meaning. The morning of the race brought even more unusual behavior. Earnhardt hugged drivers he rarely embraced. He offered encouragement to his son, Dale Jr. He spoke kindly to crew members. He told people he loved them. Small gestures. Simple words. Yet they lingered in the memories of those who heard them. Have you ever looked back at a conversation and suddenly realized how meaningful it truly was? Maybe a sentence that seemed ordinary at the time later became unforgettable. That's exactly how many people felt about their final interactions with Earnhardt. It was as if the day carried an invisible weight no one could fully understand until later. The hospital. After the crash, Earnhardt was rushed to Halifax Medical Center. Doctors immediately began emergency treatment. A full trauma team assembled. Every second mattered. Medical staff attempted every possible intervention. But the injuries were devastating. The force of the impact had caused a basilar skull fracture, one of the most severe head injuries in motorsports. Within minutes, the doctors realized the truth. There was nothing they could do. At 5:16 p.m., Dale Earnhardt was pronounced dead. He was 49 years old. The news spread quickly through the hospital, then through the racetrack, then across the country. For many fans, it felt impossible to believe. Earnhardt had built a reputation as one of the toughest drivers in racing history. He was known as the Intimidator, a fearless competitor who never backed down. How could a crash that barely looked dangerous take his life? That question haunted fans everywhere. Later that evening, NASCAR President Mike Helton stepped in front of reporters. The room was silent. Everyone knew what was coming. Helton spoke calmly, his voice steady but heavy. "We've lost Dale Earnhardt." The words echoed across television screens and radio broadcasts. For millions of fans, it felt unreal. Almost like the sport itself had lost part of its identity. But what happened next would change NASCAR forever. The tragedy that changed racing. In the months following the crash, the entire industry began re-examining safety. Engineers, team owners, drivers, officials. Everyone asked the same question. How can we make sure this never happens again? The response was swift. Within months, NASCAR introduced sweeping safety reforms. The Hans device became mandatory. Stronger harness systems were installed. New helmet standards were required. But that was only the beginning. Tracks across the country began installing energy-absorbing barriers known as safer barriers. These walls were designed to reduce the impact forces during crashes. Engineers also redesigned race cars themselves. Seats were moved closer to the center of the vehicle to protect drivers from side impacts. Advanced crash data recorders were installed to help scientists analyze accidents. Every detail mattered. Every improvement could save a life. And the results have been remarkable. In the decade since Earnhardt's death, no driver has died during a race in NASCAR's top national series. Think about that for a moment. One tragic afternoon triggered a safety revolution that continues to protect drivers today. A legacy bigger than racing. In the end, Dale Earnhardt's legacy is far greater than championships or trophies. Yes, he won 7 NASCAR titles. Yes, he drove the iconic black number 3 car. Yes, he became one of the most legendary competitors the sport has ever seen. But his true legacy may be something even more important. The safety revolution that followed his death. Because the warning he gave over the radio during that race turned out to be painfully accurate. Something had to change. And after February 18, 2001, it finally did. Today, every driver who climbs into a race car benefits from those changes. Helmets are stronger. Cars are safer. Barriers absorb energy. And the Hans device, once dismissed by many, is now standard equipment. Lives have been saved because of it. But here's a question worth thinking about. Would those changes have happened if that crash had never occurred? Or did the sport need a moment that forced everyone to face reality? History often moves forward through moments of hardship. Painful events sometimes reveal truths people were unwilling to see before. Earnhardt's final race did exactly that. And today, the sport he loved continues to evolve because of it. If you watched NASCAR during that era, One moment from that day probably stayed with you forever. Maybe it was the crash itself. Maybe it was the quiet tension as medical crews worked. Maybe it was the moment the announcement came. Or maybe it was the strange realization that racing would never be the same again. So here's one final question. When you think about Dale Earnhardt's story, what moment stays with you the most? The victory in Victory Lane? The silence in the hospital? Or the lasting changes that followed? Sometimes the most powerful legacies are not the victories we celebrate, but the lessons we learn.